Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker's Head of Case, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is going to be another installment in theology. I'm really excited for this. I have with me Dr. Austin Freeman. We're going to be talking about his new book, Tolkien Dogmatics, Theology Through Mythology with the Maker of Middle-earth. It's awesome. I'm really stoked to talk about it. We're not going to cover everything because it's huge and we couldn't do all of that. So if you are pumped about this book and the stuff that we're talking about, you need to go grab it. And if you use the link in my description, it'll also support the podcast. So that's my affiliate link. So go ahead and do that. Before we jump in, though, I want to thank everyone who is making this podcast happen. If you've benefited from this podcast, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. That would be huge. You can support for as little as $3 a month, all the way up to $100, I believe. So, man, if you like this, if this gives value, if this provides value to you, not to your life, because other things give your life value. If you like this podcast, please consider supporting it so that I can continue to have internet access and pay for that. That would be awesome. Another way to support it is sharing this podcast with a friend who likes Tolkien. You can like and leave your comments. Maybe Dr. Freeman will come back and see those, so be nice. But yeah, you can be critical, I guess. So there's a lot of ways to support the pod. Please do so if you like this. Without further ado, though, let's bring in Dr. Austin Freeman and talk about Tolkien Dogmatics.
Oh, hello.
Yeah,
How are we today? Yeah.
that's so great. Were you already wearing this before?
Oh, I mean, it's what people expect, right? When you write
Yes,
a book on Tolkien, you
that's
got to
right.
get.
So I've just recently, actually, like I know you're saying that, but that's true. Like I've actually come to the belief that I should start dressing like a professor when I give talks and stuff like that, when I present papers or give apologetics talks, because it helps the ambiance. Like people are expecting that, and if I can help them get in the right state of mind just by dressing a certain way, then let's do that. Yeah, I'm stoked for that.
I lost you there for a second. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
it's interesting you should say that. I teach at a classical school, and it's a long-standing debate as to why the students need to wear uniforms. And I tell them every time that the way that you dress affects the way that you think. So big
Yeah.
advocate for that.
That's awesome. I was totally not into that before. And as I'm studying more and more philosophy, I don't know, man. The philosophers are like, whatever. I'm wearing this, and all the theologians that I'm coming from are like, tweed jacket. Of course, I'm gonna do that. So I was at
Yeah.
ETS. Yeah, and I was at ETS, and like people were kind of giving me were teasing me for wearing like a bow tie and stuff. And I'm like, dude, I'm coming from theology. Like this is totally normal over there.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right. I love that. Well, awesome, man. Can you tell us a little bit about your theological background? Like, where'd you do your PhD at?
Sure. I did my PhD at the very place that you're sitting right now, Trinity Evangelical Divinity
Yeah,
School.
let's
Represent.
go.
There
Let's
you
go.
go.
Let's go.
Um,
I'm actually not there anymore, but I'm very close by
okay.
in an undisclosed location.
So the locale. So
Yeah.
yeah, we were there for 4 years. I did my PhD in systematic theology under the great, the legendary, the mythic Kevin Van Hooser.
The Who's.
Yep, the man.
Love that.
And so I did my dissertation on theological paradox, which is sort of
Mm.
an interdisciplinary PhD dealing with knowledge of God and divine mystery and language and all sorts of things. But as many people do, I also had other research interests at the same time, and I started working on this book while I was still in the PhD, and that's where everybody seemed to want to hear me talk. Was about
Yeah.
Tolkien and Lovecraft and literature and that sort of stuff. So that's what I have continued on to do since graduation, and I've shifted over into theology and literature and theology and the arts more broadly. So I teach at Houston Christian University, no longer Houston Baptist University. I do a lot of
Oh,
the
okay.
apologetics department, dealing with great texts and things like that.
Man, that's awesome. Uh, in the you piqued my interest with the paradox stuff. I mean, did you mess with like James Anderson stuff at all? Did you look into that? Okay. Did you what can you give us like a summary? Like where do you come down? Like do you think there is paradox and we're justified in believing it?
So I at the beginning, I articulate that I will adopt Anderson's definition of paradox
Hmm,
as merely apparent
cool.
contradiction. I actually just emailed him
McCrew.
like a week
Yeah.
ago, and JV Fesco, because there's a sort of a bevy of approaches within the Van Tillian sphere. I'm not a Van Tillian, but it seems like that's all
Yeah.
of the paradox people are talking. Um, and some of the stuff that the Van Tillians do, like Brant Bosserman, I was
Hmm.
just very, very much against, and like stridently against. And
Yeah.
but Anderson's approach, I think, is a lot more healthy and actually retains the ability to support the laws of logic and things like that. Um,
Sure.
yeah, so I came down on the fact that paradox is a result of passing over that creator creature distinction, right? In theology, we're passing
Yeah.
back and forth along this line that separates the creature and the creator, and
Yeah.
so we have different forms of knowledge, and Tolkien will actually talk about this in some of his writings, is that English
Mm.
is one of the rare languages that doesn't have two different forms for knowing, separating between personal and
Yeah.
factual knowledge. Um, so
Yeah.
it
That's right.
used
Yeah.
to, which is preserved in the English word wit. So if someone says to wit, or that somebody is witty, that is the leftover, the vestigial uh, form of the English wissen from the German wissen versus kennen.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, dude, I did not know that.
Kennen
Is that
becomes
like
no.
Wissenschaft too? Like Vision?
Yeah.
Okay.
So kennen becomes no, and wissen becomes wit, and then wit drops away. So one of the things I think
Oh.
English theology in particular gets into issues with is the failure to distinguish between knowing a person and knowing a fact.
Yeah.
And so I say that in theology, it's presupposed that we can know God, and we know God through union with Christ and through the illumination of the Spirit. So we're united with God in one form of knowledge, but there's a whole different set of rules when we talk about articulating the things that we know when we know a person, and that's where the weird sort of paradox comes in.
Yeah, dang, that's so good. Yeah, like knowledge attribution, and I yeah, I'm in an epistemology class right now, and this guy Matthew Benton, this philosopher, he makes this clear distinction, and he still motivates it through. He says, we still do have these concepts of personal knowledge, interpersonal knowledge, knowledge of facts. They just come out. So he gives like different instances of sentences where that can be true, and it's funny because we have to do that. Like you said, we don't have the words for it anymore. So you have to look at different sentences and say like, well, look, he's saying he knows that, but you wouldn't say I know that Parker. You'd say I know Parker, and so that's fun, man. That's so cool. I'll have to. You got to send me your dissertation. That'd be really fun. Is there
Yeah,
any?
so I
You gonna
came
turn that
down.
into a book at
I
all, or?
proposed to use the term familiarity instead of knowledge, relational term, and it has the core of that family in there. We're part
Mm,
of God's economy, God's works. Um, so that was my
yeah.
little contribution to that. But yeah, I can send it to you if you want. But as I said, I haven't really touched it in about 5 years. I've been doing other stuff like writing this thing.
Yeah. Seriously. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, do that, please. Let's jump in on this then. So, uh, this is let me give you a really easy one. Was Tolkien a theologian?
Tolkien is a theologian in the sense that everybody is a theologian, and in the sense that everybody
Okay.
has a more or less ordered way of thinking about God. And
Yeah.
Tolkien is more conscious of that than probably most people who are reading Lord of the Rings just for fictional fun time. I mean, he's
Yeah.
a tier one intellectual at the premier university in the world, and at a time when scholarship is really still at the highest level. And so he, despite being an English professor and a professor of languages, um, was just very invested in his own faith and in making links between different elements of his life. And so he was engaged in very many theological conversations with other people who we would consider to be um, professional theologians, such as Austin Farrer or
Yeah.
other priests and scholars at the Birmingham Oratory. The Inklings we know from letters from Warnie Lewis, C.S. Lewis's brother. A lot of times people would think that they were being quite rowdy, but really they're just debating theology. So we know
Yeah.
that that's a constant sort of familiar element in Tolkien's conversations with C.S. Lewis and his other friends. So yes, I would say Tolkien is a theologian, but Tolkien would also very firmly say that he is a lay theologian, and that he is
Yeah.
not professionally trained. He's got that mastery of British understatement, so that he always hedges when he talks about his theology, at least in public. But in his personal writings, he's very clear and direct about his theological opinions. So, for instance, he takes C.S. Lewis to task in private letters about
Yeah.
certain theological positions that Lewis has taken in his writings. So, for instance, about divorce or remarriage, other things like that. doctrine of prayer. So, yes, the long answer to the short question, was Tolkien a theologian? Yes, he was.
Yeah.
But when we talk about analyzing Tolkien's theology, we have to do it a bit more indirectly than we would with somebody like Kevin Van Hooser, for instance,
Yeah.
because Tolkien, it is said, he manifests all of the things that are most deeply felt to him in the form of story. And so
Yeah.
this book looks at all of Tolkien's nonfiction writings, literally everything that he wrote. But then we also have to filter through and analyze the fictional stuff, the Middle Earth stuff as well, and see what truths we can draw from that fiction.
Yeah. So that brings me to that's super good, by the way. But this brings me to like the scope of the book and its intended use. Um, some people might be like, "Man, another book on Tolkien." And, like, if you like Tolkien, you're probably not saying that because it's like, bring on all the books. But, like, yeah, what is the scope? What's the use of this book, and then how is it different than the ones we already
Yep.
have?
Yeah. Of the making of Tolkien books, there can be no end, right? Yeah,
That's
there
right.
are plenty of really good books on, for instance, the spiritual themes in the Lord of the Rings, or reading Frodo's journey devotionally, things like this. There are even some scholarly studies on Tolkien's theology in Middle Earth, but there has not been at all any study of Tolkien as a theologian himself, right? So
Mm.
there has not been a study of Tolkien the man and the way that his thought hangs together systematically. So that's the big
Mm.
difference in this book, is I'm not restricting myself to just reading the Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion and talking about the spiritual themes that he inserts there. I'm also reading his letters. I'm reading his Old English and Middle English criticism. I'm reading all of his other scholarly work. I'm reading the non Middle Earth fiction, such as Leaf by Niggle. And so,
Mm.
taking every element of Tolkien's life, plus all of the secondary literature, all of the friends and family members that spoke about the things that he believed, I'm putting all of that together, not to focus on Middle Earth, but to focus on Tolkien as a man, as a scholar, as a thinker. And of course, Middle Earth plays a large part in that, but that is not the direct focus.
Yeah. I really like that, and, you anticipated a lot of, like, pushback and questions. Like, one question I had was, like, I from what I had read of Tolkien, a about Tolkien, he's, like, super staunch, Roman Catholic, and, he was, like, ma from what I hear, he was, like, mad at Lewis, for being so public since he wasn't a priest, public apologist, stuff like that. So I thought, whatever we need to know about Tolkien, we could just get from the catechism, of the Roman Catholic Church. And you address that then. You're like, "Well, no, like, there's still some room." Can you explain that? Like, why, how is it that we can still learn something from someone who just says, like, "There's my theology right there in the catechism."
Well, I mean, every Roman Catholic theologian would say that, right? So
Yeah.
every Roman Catholic theologian is under saving obedience to the church, and is going to believe what the church believes. And that didn't stop Hans Urs von Balthasar from writing like a shelf worth of stuff. It didn't stop
Seriously.
Henri de Lubac from doing this same sort of thing. So, insofar as there is a point in writing Catholic theology at all, there's a point in analyzing Tolkien and his own contributions. And I think what you mentioned is exactly another reason why it needs to be done, because even if you're coming at things from the Roman Catholic side, and I have many Roman Catholic friends who I've talked to this book about and sort of put it in front of them to say, is this an accurate portrayal of what it would have been like for him? Including, for instance, Carl Hofstadter. I'll name drop him, the
Yeah.
recent editor of Nature of Middle Earth.
Yeah.
So the fact that Tolkien did not go to seminary, he's sort of picking up his theology from his own reading, from the homilies that are being given to him at his parish church, that sort of thing. There are instances in which Tolkien would want to say, look, if I've written something that goes against the dogma, I need to be called out on that. And there are a few instances in the book where I sort of press him, not too many, but the idea is the fact that Tolkien is sort of eclectic in his theological reading makes for a subject worthy of analysis. Not just saying,
Yeah.
well, here's the Catholic Catechism, section 26, or whatever we say.
Yeah. That's so good. So, you touched on so many themes that I've been thinking about myself just over the years. Like, um, My dad writes a lot of fiction himself, science fiction, and, so from that, my whole life, I've kinda been aware of, like, the hero with 10,000 faces type stuff and the story arc and how, like, yeah, we watched Jackie Chan movie, and my dad would be like, "Well, Jackie Chan's gotta get beat up first," and then, all this kinda stuff. And then, growing up and seeing, like, there's No Country for Old Men, where, like, spoiler alert, the bad guy wins, and thinking, like, I kinda like that movie because I've seen the hero win so much, and my dad was like, "No, that is not how you tell a good story." So just thinking of, like, the ethics of storytelling and, whether or not a Christian, a Catholic can write a story that is based on a different world and has, like, different motifs has always been kind of a question for me. And thinking of Tolkien writing to I think it was Aud I don't know how to say his name actually, I never said it out loud.
Yeah.
Auden, the poet? It is Auden? Auden? Okay. He was writing to the poet and I think he was, like, defending whether or not, the orcs are, like, heretical for him to write about. Can you Is that right? Did
Um,
I read that right?
yeah. So I can't remember if that's to W.H. Auden or not, but yes, that's one of the big quagmires that Tolkien sorts of writes himself into is the orcs as this sort of pure evil race, and he says this theologically this is a problem, right? So um,
Yeah.
if if the orcs are evil as a race, that is, if they are born evil, that seems to be something beyond what Melkor or Sauron could do. That seems to
Mm,
be something that has to do with the very basic level of creation and being. And so he says, then how did the orcs come to be? Because with human beings, we know that it's actually God that curses them to be born into sin. So what do we do with the orcs? And the question of the orcs is a contested issue that changes a lot during Tolkien's lifetime. And I have a section in the book about Tolkien's changing views of the orcs and where they come from and how they fit into his doctrine of evil. But he basically says orcs are to be treated as we would any prisoner of war. They are to be given mercy if they ask for it, even if you know they're going to betray you, and
hmm.
you give them basically human rights. There is no instance of an orc who is good in Tolkien's writing. I don't think that's a the sort of book that he was interested in.
Huh.
But if he would have lived longer, if he would have lived 10, 20 more years, he probably would have gotten around to it. We know those were the sorts of questions that he was dealing with towards the end of his life.
Hmm. Does does, does that have anything to do with, like, like, a privationist view of evil that, like, uh if something exists, it is in some degree good? Does it have to do with that?
Very much so, 100%. So I have
Okay.
another publication in the Journal of England Studies where Tom Shippey, who's sort of the doyen, the baron, the grandmaster of Tolkien studies, um, way back in The Road to Middle Earth and Author of the Century, he argues that Tolkien sort of has a tension between what he calls the Boethian or Augustinian view of evil as privation, and then what he calls the Manichaean view of evil as a positive thing in itself. And he says that because
Mm,
Tolkien is trained as a medievalist and a Catholic, he wants to uphold this Augustinian view, and yet his experiences in World War One are pulling him towards the fact that evil is something that needs to be fought and not just pitied. So
yeah.
Boethius, in I think it's book 3 of Constellation of Philosophy, said that ultimately evil is something that you should pity rather than feel anxious about. Augustine
Yeah.
says that, by the way. Um, so yes, he's very conscious of this heritage. I mean, King Alfred the Great, of Anglo-Saxon glory and fame, wrote a commentary on Boethius, which is actually more of a paraphrase because we know by comparing the manuscripts that King Alfred actually inserts quite a lot of other material, commenting and
Huh.
expanding on Boethius, and particularly in these passages. So this tension that Shippey throws up or sort of inserts about Boethian versus Manichaean views of evil. Even Shippey ultimately says Tolkien comes down on the Augustinian Boethian side, but um, it's been a huge distraction in terms of writing about Tolkien's theology of evil and writing about how Tolkien deals with evil. Everybody feels like they've got to address this issue. And in my
Hmm.
article, I say that it's a false problem, and we need to start to broach new modes of reading Tolkien's writing about evil because he's very clearly an Augustinian. I mean, he says it in so many words. He even has Frodo say it and Elrond say it. Right? Nothing is
Huh.
evil in the beginning. Even Sauron
Yeah.
was not so. So
Yeah.
he's very strongly in that camp.
Yeah. No, that's yeah, that's super huge. Um, sorry, just sticking on that. Does the evil is to be pitied? Does that come from like a Platonist understanding of evil being like ignorance?
Yes.
Okay.
Platonist or Neoplatonist. So when Boethius is talking about it, Lady Philosophy is sort of in his prison cell and telling him why uh, it's not the case that evil just gets away with everything. That's one of Boethius's big complaints at the beginning, is that he's in this cell and all of the evil people are getting away with these false accusations, and how then is the world just? And she says, well,
Right.
actually, uh, good people are the only people that achieve their desires, because they achieve goodness, and goodness is happiness, and that's the thing that everybody wants. Wicked
Yeah.
people, by definition, do not have goodness and therefore do not have happiness. And it's the most important thing to have, and they don't have it. So,
Mm.
what a bunch of pathetic losers they are.
Yeah.
Act rather than being jealous of Theodoric or these other people that have put you in prison, Boethius, you need to, more than that, you need to pity them, because they're the ones that are losing out on the ultimate prize.
Yeah. That's tough when you're in it.
Mhm.
But yeah,
But
it's
Tolkien would
so
have known
good.
that as well. I mean, pity,
Yeah.
he'll capitalize it. Pity is one of his central themes. He defines pity more as Christian virtue of charity, of agape love, rather than pity of just sort of like looking down on somebody that's beneath you.
Yeah. Oh man. Now we're this is all sorts of implications for like loving your enemy and stuff, which is very Christian and very tough. Yeah.
Yep, there's a Gollum in
That's
that
awesome.
story.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, okay. Uh I picked up on this like myth making as a clue to the true myth, and um I want to ask about that because I think maybe Lewis was a little bit louder with that, like myth became fact type stuff. But I think he got that from
Yes, he
Tolkien.
did. Um,
Okay.
a lot of Lewis's trademark ideas he kind of snuck from Tolkien, by the way. Yeah, so
Yeah.
in Tolkien's poem Mythopoeia, which is one of my favorite poems of all time, it's the poem that he writes after the fact, on the famous Addison's Walk between Hugo Dyson and C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, sort of bringing Lewis to the burgeoning conclusion that Christianity is the true myth.
Hmm.
And so that is in that poem. Tolkien says this is the way that we ought to look at things. That God redeems the corrupt making creatures, human beings. Right, we are intrinsically designed to be makers because we are in the image of the Maker. He redeems the makers with a made thing, with a story.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that the idea of myth becoming fact is something that's central to Tolkien's understanding of the story of redemption. And yes, you are right. Lewis is borrowing that. We know Tolkien
Yeah.
did it first because Lewis wasn't even a Christian when Tolkien said it.
Yeah. That's so good. Yeah. That's mytho. Is it mythopoesis or mythopoeia? Is that the name of
Mythopoeia
it?
is the name of the
Mythopoeia.
poem. Mythopoesis is
Yeah.
the name of the activity. You can say
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great poem. Yeah. Like I don't know. I think maybe Tim Keller would talk about it a lot. So I'm like, I need to go read this. And then I was like, wait a second, Tolkien's been saying this, and like, um, how, in the book you talk about how Tolkien saw myth making as a clue towards like the true myth.
Yeah.
Um, can you help us out? Like, how is myth making an evidence that there is a myth that is true, like the great true myth that became fact or whatever?
So I want to start a few steps back before I answer that question. We got to understand the context that
Yeah.
Tolkien's writing out of. So um, he is going to school. He's being educated with the leftovers of the scholarship of Victorian England. Tolkien is an Edwardian, but he's in the midst of the myth wars of all of these people who are uh, taking part in this growing trend of anthropological cultural studies. The Brothers Grimm, all of these people, they're finding these national epics, they're studying myth and the origins of myth. And so there are a lot of possible interpretations of what myth is. Is it
Hmm.
the record of ancient rituals and sacrifices? Is it just a sort of a kernel of fact which then gets blown up over time? Is it a way of talking about the seasons? There's all sorts of different theories that get propounded at this time, and one of them, was that mythology is a disease of language. That is the phrase that gets used and that Tolkien combats in
Huh.
On Fairy Stories. Um, and he says, no, far from being a disease of language, some sort of excrescence that language throws off as our words change. He says mythology is at the heart of language. Like that is how language functions. And we
Hmm.
see this get picked up in a much different way by somebody like Paul Ricoeur, who talks about the centrality of symbol and metaphor in our everyday speech. Um,
You had to mention record
yeah,
because you
well,
studied with Van Hooser.
yep.
Yeah.
So the, when Tolkien starts to say that myth is a window into reality, he is reacting against a lot of people that want to sideline myth and say that it's not worth looking at, or if it's worth looking at, it's only worth looking at as a window into the human soul. And Tolkien says, no,
Yeah.
myth is a window into something outside of ourselves. And he says the very fact that there's this huge um, concerted effort throughout all times and places and cultures to make these sorts of stories ought to indicate to us that it is a part of what it means to be human. And so for Tolkien, he says, even if Thor and Odin and all of these other myths were made up by people, the very
Yeah.
fact that we give the thunderstorm this particular personality needs to be explained. And so
Hmm.
he actually flips the table on people and says, this demands an answer. This demands an explanation somehow. And for him, it's in the image of God that God has made us to be sub-creators. He has created us to rule over the world and to create stories in the way that God has created his story. And myth
Yeah.
is the exemplar of that.
That's so good. So that's such a good segue into like subcreation. I love the language, by the way, and Tolkien messed with me so bad when I read I don't know if it's Tree and Leaf or it's like a collection of his essays, and I learned about subcreation, and I was like, well, maybe we can create something whole cloth, and then like I couldn't do it, and maybe someone still can, but I can't. Like we still take pre-existing ideas, and I don't think we can ever make anything ex nihilo the way God did. Um, but when it comes to our own mythopoesis, Mike, are there other ethics to it? Like,
Yes.
um, there are. Like, I think of like DC
So Tolkien
Comics.
will say
I know
that.
that you love like nerdy stuff. I'm finding out that I'm like a nerd. Do you read DC at all? Do you?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Tolkien will say that there are
Yeah.
limits to the author's imagination, but only in certain respects. So, for one thing, the law of non-contradiction
Okay.
needs to be upheld. So your story needs to make sense; it needs to hold together. Um, and then, if you want to place the story within this world, as he does with Middle Earth, he says that Middle
Oh
Earth
yeah.
is our world in a sort of fictionalized prehistoric past. And so, if he's going to make that decision, then he's going to
Mm.
bind himself. One reformed person might even say he's going to covenant himself to follow a certain set of rules. Like the origin of humanity, for instance, needs to be consonant with the biblical origin of humanity because we know that's actually how it happened in this world. Right? Middle Earth may
Okay.
be a pre-Christian realm, but it's not a pre-creational realm. Right? There's this time period between the creation of the universe and the call of Abraham. That's when all this stuff is taking place. And so, if you're setting your story there, then you are binding yourself to follow the rules that are set out that kind of keep you in the framework of the biblical picture there. Tolkien is very influenced by other people that have come before him, like George MacDonald and William Morris and John Ruskin and other English romantics. And they're basically going to say also that you can make the sun green and you can make grass blue and you can do whatever else, but the thing that doesn't change, whether in this world or in fairyland, is the moral law. The moral law always stays the same.
Hmm.
So the instantiation of the moral law, right, that gap between principle and application is always what gets us into trouble in ethics, right? Everybody agrees about the principle. It's just, what do I do in this particular instance? Um,
Hmm.
that might have different implications in different worlds, but the moral law as such remains the same and it's universal because we are still sub-creators, and the moral law of God is part of God's essence, and so that's the same in every possible world. Creation, the laws of creation can change, but the moral law reflects the essence of God, and therefore, in every possible world, it is identical.
Nice. Okay. Okay. Um, yeah, I think we were cut off here. Um, when I was asking the question earlier. But did you hear me ask about DC Comics
No,
at all?
but I want to. Okay.
Okay. Okay. I mean, I'm discovering that I'm like a huge nerd. And I didn't know this until like recently, but I love all sorts of nerdy stuff, but including DC Comics and Marvel Comics. And so like this whole year, I've just been like getting into it. Do you read DC at all?
Oh yeah, I got to give you a reading list. If we're going there, I got to give you a reading list to get caught up. Yes, I'm very much
Yeah.
more in favor of DC. I do like Marvel, but I like DC more, and it's primarily for this reason. In that, um, look at the history of comic books. Um, DC or the brands that DC bought, they come first. They're older, and they're closer to the genesis of
Okay.
the need for comic books, which is wishful. Comic books are the American mythology, and so all of the heroes that DC has in their sort of wheelhouse, they are these mythical figures. When Marvel comes around in the '60s, Marvel is doing something very different, and they want to humanize their characters. They want to make their characters relevant and relatable. And so Marvel is the Boltman of the comic world, and they're looking to demythologize some of these mythical figures. Um, so that's why I like DC more, because I feel like that's what comics is for. When you
Mm,
see Batman and Superman on the screen in a Zack Snyder movie, you don't have to have had like 3 or 4 setup movies in order to understand who they are. Like, we know who they are. They are Hercules, they are Achilles, they are Zeus. Like, their meaning is within themselves. We all know who these characters are, um,
yeah.
and you can just feel more free to play with them and to play with the ideas.
Yeah. Well, okay, so jumping in on that, I've been looking at like um DC's got this problem of rebooting and their crises events. And they keep having them over and over, and they keep, retconning the origin of the
Mhm.
universe. Is it like, would Tolkien think that it's wrong for them to have like this great darkness and this great light where it's like maybe Manichaean or something? Like,
Yeah,
could you tell us he would say
that
that you
particular
shouldn't do
story,
that?
yeah, I think he would have a big problem with that. It would irritate the heck out of
Okay.
him. I know it irritates me. In the rebooting, I think that he wouldn't necessarily say that it's immoral. I think he would say it's lazy storytelling, or that it's cheap. But what interests me about DC and Marvel and all of these reboots is that they're not actually reboots, right? Because
Yeah.
within the universes themselves, within the fictional universes, these are different events that are happening, and you'll always have these
Yeah.
holdover characters that remember the way that it was before. So in a sense,
Yeah.
DC has never rebooted. They have never just like made a break and said we're going to start over with new stuff. It's always an
Right.
in-universe explanation for why things are now different, which
Yeah.
is a fascinating philosophical issue when you think about it. I mean, it makes me think of like Hud Hudson and hypertime and that sort of stuff. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't think that he would find it a moral problem so much as a mechanical sort of storytelling problem.
Well, so what I'm thinking of is like, I think Earth Prime. No, not Earth Prime. Earth, wherever Superboy Prime is from,
Yeah,
that's our
yeah.
Earth. And
But
so
it's
like
not
our Earth
anymore, right?
isn't.
Because now it's separated from our Earth because we're making stories about it.
Yeah. But if you did want to be like self-referential in that, be like, okay, our Earth is included in the DC Omniverse. Would Tolkien have a problem because then you're telling like a different creation story and there's not just one. Oh, I guess it depends on if DC has a God above all or the one above all that is God. But do you see what I'm getting at? Like
Yeah,
the
they
ethics of
do. So
the theology
they
there.
have the source. I actually have an essay on this. Um,
Oh, nice.
so they have the source, and the source is supposed to be the Yahwistic God, which is why it's never um, necessarily in the stories, and it's never described so much. It's supposed to be this sort of aniconic figure, to avoid
It's not Jack Kirby.
alienating. No, that's Marvel. Yeah, in Marvel, it's Jack Kirby.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
yeah, I think that for Tolkien, if we're setting it in this world, then it needs to be consonant with the biblical picture of the world in order to be
Okay.
correct. And I think DC has introduced enough um, aberrations from the biblical worldview to say that this is probably not a good idea. But I think Tolkien is also like a reasonable enough person to realize that not everybody is going to agree with the Christian picture of things, and that um,
Right.
if you're if you're Marv Wolfman or whoever that is writing these stories, then I mean, what else do we expect them to say?
Would he suggest like not reading it though?
Hmm. No, I mean Tolkien read all sorts of things. He read a lot
Okay.
of things that he disagreed with very much. So Tolkien would not have adopted the pagan mythology of the Eddas, but we know that he read and enjoyed them very much. Um,
Okay.
in his story of Kullervo, which is a precursor to the story of Turin Turambar, Kullervo is a hero from the Finnish Kalevala, and Tolkien sort of redid that bit of the story for himself. We find that he's actually theologically disgusted with some of the things that go on in that story.
Hmm.
There's a sort of a shadowy typology of Mary that goes on in this story, and Tolkien says
Hmm.
this is far below and degraded from what the real Mary ought to be, and yet he writes a
Yeah.
whole book retelling the story. So no, I think that Tolkien was very widely read, and we'll see. In Holly Ordway's book, Tolkien's Modern Reading, she demonstrates there's a lot of things that Tolkien read that even though he disagrees with it, he could still take enjoyment from it as a story. And for him, I think that's primary.
Okay. So when it comes to Middle Earth, and because it is a pre-incarnate, pre-redemption world like ours, or in place of a mythical, ours in mythology. There we go, something like that. Um, like Eru Illúvatar, like is that God? Like, is it relevantly similar? It is like to Yahweh.
Yeah, he's Yahweh.
Okay.
Yeah, so he
I
is
always
the narrative form that Yahweh takes. I mean, obviously, philosophically, he's not identical to Yahweh because Yahweh is real and this is a fictional story, but he is meant to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yes, he's not a
okay.
stand-in or a
Um,
substitute. He's the same entity.
Gotcha. Okay. So what about the Trinity? Like,
Mm.
so some theologians will look at Yahweh's use of "let us make man in our image," and they'll say like, there's some room there for the Trinity. Others will say no, it's the royal we, and the Jews would have never interpreted it that way. Does Tolkien do anything like that with Ilúvatar, hinting at like being able to be a Trinitarian type guy?
Yeah, yes, he does. So in the conversation Athrobeth Finrod Andreth, or in the English version, the conversation of Finrod and Andreth, it's in one of
Yeah.
the volumes of the History of Middle Earth, which is the posthumous manuscripts that Christopher Tolkien, his son, released. There is a conversation where Finrod talks about this. Finrod, by the
Hmm.
way, if we've been watching Rings of Power, is Galadriel's brother that gets killed and that makes her so angry. It's the same guy. Also, the ring that Aragorn wears in Lord of the Rings, the sort of silver one with the green stone and the serpents, that's Finrod's ring that has been passed down through Aragorn's family.
Snap. Okay.
So this guy Finrod, he's at the edges of a lot of different stories, but uh, he's talking to this human woman, and in their conversation, mostly it's about the fall and mortality. But there, Finrod says that if Morgoth is to be conquered, then Eru must come into Middle Earth himself in order to do it. And
Hmm.
yet, in doing so, he would also remain as he is, was the author outside of the story. And so, in this case, we can sort of see there are distinctions. Tolkien says in his commentary on the story, there are distinctions within the one, while he yet remains the one. Um,
Nice.
the secret fire, which is in the Ainulindale at the beginning of the Silmarillion. There's a section in my book where I talk about whether the secret fire is to be the Holy Spirit or not. Most people
Yeah.
will take it to be the Holy Spirit in some sense. Um, the Son does not get talked about within the stories because it is not yet time for the Son to be revealed. So the
Yeah.
fullness of time is not yet. But there are enough hints within Middle Earth that yes, Eru is Trinitarian, or at least there are mysteries to Eru's being that not everybody knows about yet.
Yeah. That's so good. Okay, so here's one that I actually don't know which came first. It was probably Tolkien's, but Lewis and Tolkien both, in depicting the creation of their fictional worlds, depict the world being sung into existence. Do you know if I mean was that Tolkien's first
Yeah,
and
so
and
Tolkien wrote Ainulindale in 1917, 1918. So he's writing that as he's in the trenches, some of it, and then while he's convalescing after
wow.
getting trench fever and getting pulled back. And then obviously Narnia doesn't come out until the 40s, 50s.
Yeah. Okay.
So quite a lot longer before Lewis is doing it. I told you. So they're both talking about singing.
Yeah.
So the singing element is, yes, Tolkien did it first, but it is I would say a bit of creative license on his part in order to illustrate some of the principles. We know music was very important to him. Um,
Mhm.
we know music was particularly very important to his wife Edith, who would have been the primary audience at the time. They had just been married, so the concept of harmony and dissonance and all of that sort of thing. I think there's reasons for that. Um, sounds pretty too. If you're
Yeah.
going to if you're going to involve the angels in creation, then you have to give them something to do. And
Yeah.
so, rather than just have God speak it and it be this sort of monologic activity, if you're going to have the angels participate as sub-creators, then they have to have roles, obviously. And I think putting them into a choir or a symphony is one easy way to do that.
Yeah. I asked Chris Wiley, C.R. Wiley, about this, and he brought up the Music Man and was like, "Hey, singing is just sustained talking," and I thought that was pretty funny. And he was saying like it doesn't have to be just one or the other kind of thing. Like, what do you make of that? Like, could God have created through singing? Could in the beginning God said, "Let there be light"? Could there been like some resonance or like harmonics or
Well, I
something?
mean, everything we know says that our speech about God is analogical, right? There are
Yeah.
similarities and there are differences. Um, we know that God accommodates himself to human modes of speech, right? God doesn't
Yeah.
have vocal cords, at least not outside of his human nature in Christ. And so,
Right.
whatever we say in Genesis 1, we have to interpret um, somewhat loosely
Yeah.
because of the nature of what we're dealing with. Um, Depending on who you side with and how poetically you want to read Genesis 1 through 3. What is the difference between poetry and song, really? So
Mm,
I guess I would
yeah.
say always possible. Uh,
Yeah.
Now, this is one of those areas actually where Tolkien sort of departs from Catholic tradition. So for Aquinas, for instance, Aquinas specifically denies a role to angels in creation. He says
Yeah.
angels did not do anything, whereas for Tolkien, they sort of fill out quite a lot. So he takes a little bit of independence in this story in particular. What's interesting is this is one of the first things he writes in Middle Earth, and it's also basically unchanged until his death. So he writes this story. He tinkers with so much and so much else of his writing, but this particular story kind of stays stable through
Hmm.
his entire life, more or less.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I like that in the book you showed, or you talked about a lot of the things that have changed. Um, but yeah, that's so fascinating that this one didn't change. So I wonder, like, this is taking place in Middle Earth. Middle Earth is like a mythical depiction of Earth prior to the incarnation. So, like, I wonder how he's okay with saying that like angels participated in creation. What do you make of that?
Well, in my chapter on angels in the book, before I get too far into it, I realized that I got to speak to my audience and assuage their difficulties. So I do a little bit of biblical theology at the beginning of the chapter, and I say that
Yeah.
actually Tolkien's version of angels is a lot closer to the Old Testament context than our modern sort of 21st century Protestant view of angels, which has them really not
Hmm.
doing much of anything. I mean, God asked Job, "Where were you when the morning stars sang together at creation?" Right? We know stars means angels in sort of biblical symbolism. They're singing together at the beginning of creation and praising God for the thing that He has laid out. There are
Yeah.
many instances of angels being said to be present at the dawn of time. Um, we know that angels are his ministers and his servants and his messengers. And so I think Tolkien has enough leeway in the text to say that angels could have participated in the shaping of the cosmos, right? That he says the
Yeah.
Valar are most active in the sort of cosmic timescales.
Okay.
Right? Before the planet gets formed, they are the ones that are sort of spreading out the nebulae and lighting the stars, and they're there, moving the tectonic plates so that the Earth gets shaped correctly. Um, So the fact that God alone is the source of being, Tolkien says that very explicitly. Like Morgoth goes looking for things that he can make on his own. It says he was looking for the secret fire, but he found it not, for it is with Illúvatar.
Yeah.
God alone is the one that actually gives life and existence. And so the angels are actually just shaping pre-existing things in accordance with God's plan for them. So God says, this is what I want. This is the music that I want you to perform. And within that, you are free to make your own interpretations of that. I mean, if you think about music, there might be one Rachmaninoff piece, and 3 different piano players will play the same piece, and you'll get a different result based on that person's personality, right? So
Yeah.
they're following the same notes, but their personality is expressed in that, and I think that's what Tolkien is doing with the angels. God gives them the sheet music to play, and they follow his commands after he's given it being. But it says each of them is able to recognize their own handiwork. So I think that he gives the creation proper still fully over to God, and the angels remain the ministers. So I think he stays within the bounds of orthodoxy there.
Okay. How about I believe it was Melkor who was singing like discordant music into the initial music, and then Eru is like, even that was according to my plan. I mean, what do you make of that with like the devil and or Satan and also does Tolkien give an initial explanation for Malkor's fall?
He does not.
Okay.
Bible, we might note. So he says that Melkor has started becoming a little weird because he goes often alone into the void looking for the secret fire. That's not necessarily said to be a sin yet, but we do know that he is isolating himself from the rest of the angelic community, and that he is maybe considering breaking away, depending on your doctrine of the will. Is that a sin or not if your will hasn't fully ascended to it? Like, he leaves that open. He says, like, this is as close as we can come to sort of figuring out why he did this and the other angels didn't.
Yeah.
But yeah, the other issue is that God is working all of that into his plan, and he says actually the worst things that Melkor has done actually end up turning into or coming out of that as some of the best things. And I think that's just such a powerful passage in the Silmarillion, where he talks about how God's subverting all of the devil's designs. I mean, speaking of Tim Keller earlier, I heard him preach at one point in Memphis, and the line always stuck with me as he said, how many people lost their faith there at the foot of the cross, where the greatest thing that God ever did for humanity was happening in front of them.
Right.
So the idea of providence is a big one for Tolkien, and you sort of have to stitch it together from several different areas. But the idea of how much God knows of the future and how much God is in control of it is not one that Tolkien ever explicitly says, other than like the very high level, everything is under the hand of God and everything will work out according to God's design. But like mechanically, granularly, how much control he has, that's a topic of discussion in an extended passage in the book where I try to harmonize those things.
Yeah.
And I think that honestly, at some points, Tolkien almost sounds like a Molinist, but I doubt that he would have been familiar with Molinism based on his reading and his interests. And some places he sounds very much like a Calvinist, or really a Thomist, because that's basically the same thing on this score. And then in other places, he's very much in line with traditional Catholic doctrine, which emphasizes the freedom of the will of human creatures. So in the book, I try to do some work to sort of tease these out, rather than I think what a lot of people would say, oh, he just contradicts himself on providence. I think, well, maybe there's more to be said there. But it is, that's a complex issue in his thought.
Well, when it I know some people will talk about Lord of the Rings and be like, look, this is like deism. You don't see like specific instances of Illúvatar like interceding or intervening or anything like that. What do you make of that charge? Like, is Tolkien's God a deistic God?
Absolutely not. I think if you read the Lord of the Rings carefully, even within the Lord of the Rings, which is considered the most godless of Tolkien's book, it's very clear that God is doing things. For instance, the Council of Elrond is never called. They all just show up for their own reasons at the same time and in the same place. and they're like, "Hey, we ought to do something about this ring."
Yeah.
Just there. Gandalf will say very specifically, there was a power at work, and it was not the power of the enemy.
Hmm.
Now, some people can say this is the Valar doing things, but from what we know about the Valar and other writings, they are always doing things under the authority of and with the permission of God Himself. So it's six or half dozen on that score.
Yeah.
It's the Valar or God Himself directly. Yeah, there's plenty of instances even within the Lord of the Rings where providence is active, even in the climax. Right. So the fact that Gollum is still there to bite off Frodo's finger and fall into the lava is a result of a lot of prior decisions being made by human beings, including Frodo and Sam and Gandalf and Thranduil and Aragorn and all of these people who are agents of providence that are sometimes inspired directly by God with new thoughts, like we see Sam many times being inspired to say something, or an instance where Frodo would say, it seemed like somebody else was speaking out of his mouth.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of stuff thrown into Lord of the Rings. And when you expand it outside of Lord of the Rings, it becomes even more clear. So in the Silmarillion that we're talking about, God says that He has not showed the end of the story to anybody, that He retains the right to intervene at any point that He wants and does. Even the fall of Numenor, right? Now more people know what Numenor is now that Rings of Power has come out, right? When the Numenor
Yeah.
collapses into the earth, that is a direct act of God. The Valar
Hmm.
do not have the authority to change the shape of the world. So they actually lay down their power, and God does that Himself.
Hmm.
But especially at the level of providence, God is doing things all the time. But even above that, actual direct miraculous action, God is also doing that in several instances in the Lord of the Rings. And so in the chapter on Revelation that I have in the book, I go through all
Yeah.
of these miraculous forms of revelation, dreams and prophecies and visions and all sorts of things that are coming from the powers above. There is really very little justification. I mean, Lord of the Rings came out in 1973. Maybe for somebody that had not been reading terribly closely, we could say that God is a deist, but goodness gracious, it's 50 years since then. There's no reason to make that argument anymore. It's untenable.
So awesome. I love that. Um, uh, okay, I got two more for you. So, you mentioned in the book about foreknowledge, and omniscience, and how it is that the God of Middle Earth knows things, and whether it's like from the completed story um, or what have you. And it has to do with like the creation as well. That it seems like the creator didn't just create time and space, but also, that's just like the furniture of the story, but also the plot.
Mhm.
And can you flesh that out for us more? Like,
Yeah.
did Tolkien? Yeah, how does that represent Tolkien's view of foreknowledge and omniscience as well?
So I think the only window that we have into Tolkien's views on this, really, in an extended way, are in one of his sort of pseudo historical texts, right? Like the appendices, like where he sort of keeps maintaining this illusion that these are documents that he found, and he says, "Well, this is what the elves think," and then he'll say a bunch of philosophy. So one of the things, the most important document that we have is a document called Fate and Free Will, which Carl Hostetter published many years ago in the Tolkien Studies Journal, and that's also in the Nature of Middle Earth book that just came out that he edits. This is where a lot of that stuff comes from. And
Okay.
it's couched very significantly as a bit of elvish philosophy, which we know is not necessarily one-to-one with what does Tolkien himself think about the real world. So that's the
Right.
caveat that we have to start with at the beginning. And I note that in the book, that there are these danger points where we can go too glibly from one to the other.
Yeah.
In that document, it seems as if Eru's foreknowledge is limited by the free will of his creatures.
Hmm.
I don't think that we necessarily have to go that entire way. And I think in all of the writings that we have on providence in Middle Earth in particular, it's couched in this sort of conscious fact that this is a story that Tolkien is writing. And so the idea of narrative and of narrativity is important in all of Tolkien's Middle Earth stuff, because that's very close to the heart of what he's doing, is this doctrine of
Yeah.
subcreation and when it is valid and when it's not valid. So outside of that, how important is narrative to Tolkien's idea of providence? We don't know. We only know what's been published. But based on what's been published, I think it's incredibly important, and in fact, it's inspired a lot of my own work outside of this book. I'm trying to tease out this idea of God as author, God as author of the plot. I have another essay that was published in Zygon, in the Science and Theology journal Zygon, about Tolkien and the plot of evolution. He talks about evolution and the narrative of history. So think about all the questions that this raises. I mean, think about if we talk about God as author standing outside the text. Think about what that would mean for how we articulate a doctrine of omniscience and omnipresence. How is God present in his story? Well, in the same way that Tolkien is present in his story. He's doing everything, but his name never shows up on the cover page. Frodo decides that he's going to take the ring to Mordor. Why does he decide it? Based on the character and the previous decisions that he has laid out in his life. Nobody's forcing him to do it. It's a freely undertaken quest. And yet, Tolkien is also doing that on a separate level of being. So the idea of authorship, I think, is a huge lever into moving some of these big theological concepts like divine presence, divine hiddenness, divine action, even theodicy. Tolkien will talk about theodicy in this respect. Like Frodo and Sam have this famous talk about looking back on it, it will seem very different. And people will want to hear this story of Frodo and the 9 Fingers of the Ring of Doom, even though Frodo and Sam would rather be anywhere else. So if we think about creation as having a plot, for instance, we can think about the creation having a conflict. If Lord of the Rings didn't have a conflict, we wouldn't be reading Lord of the Rings. It would not have the beauty of the story that it does. If creation did not have an antagonist to its plot, namely the devil, then a lot of the conflict could not move forward. So there are all sorts of fascinating issues that arise when we talk about God as the author and human beings as sub-creators. And I think Tolkien puts his finger on something that for our post-Platonist world that has denied this sort of chain of being really helps us to understand all of these doctrines that for a lot of the church fathers and even the medievals, it was sort of a sine qua non, like it's taken for granted the way that they understand this stuff.
Yeah, man, you hit on so many things that I love. I wrote my master's thesis at TEDS under Van Hoos, and I wanted to write on his particular view of the authorial analogy, and I wanted to write about God and time. And he's like, well, dude, they're going to ask you about evil. And, like, what the heck? If God's the author of evil, that's a big problem. So then he made me write on evil. And it was awesome, dude. It's so helpful to think through the authorial analogy. And even thinking through like, hey, look, God made a good story. It would be a worse story without the devil because we wouldn't have redemption, and we wouldn't see God as long suffering and as loving his enemies and patient and all the different attributes of God that we see through like the prism of this story. We wouldn't know God as well if he had not allowed Satan to fall and all that
And
stuff.
think about this as well. If we understand God to be the author outside the text, it's on a different level of being than his characters. I mean, think about some of the stuff that happens in the Silmarillion, right? The dragons get released, and there's these hills of corpses of elves that have been tortured and slaughtered. But Tolkien's not morally wicked for writing that. Right? So Morgoth is morally wicked for doing that within the story, but the author outside of the story isn't really morally blameworthy for allowing that or writing that to happen. Now, I can think of stories where authors are morally wicked, and that does manifest in the sort of things that they have happen in their stories. Certain scenes I can think of very easily would demonstrate a sort of depravity in the mind of the author, but it's not a necessary implication. And so when we think about God allowing evil, even sometimes very actively, like he does with Job, God's moral status, because he is of a higher level of being than human creatures, doesn't seem to be affected in the way that it does for creatures that are on the same level of being.
Yeah. James Anderson has a great essay in Calvinism and the Problem of Evil using this, and I think he even talks about Tolkien. It's super helpful for thinking like, hey, look, how crazy would it be to go and try and arrest Tolkien for the murder of Deagle by Smeagol. Like, how dare you do that? And it's like, no, it's a different level of being. It doesn't really make sense. I could also imagine someone saying, well, if you can imagine someone being like culpable for writing a bad plot here in this level of reality, then God, superintended that whole thing. So then it passes on to God. And it's like, well, this is where I think skeptical theism comes in and go, look, you'd have to be God in order to know the full plot and be able to say that God doesn't have a morally sufficient reason for allowing that evil that we experience. We've seen that he has taken the worst evil at the cross and brought about the greatest good. So we're justified in believing that he could do that with any lesser evil that we experience. And we have to be God to know that the plot doesn't include a greater good. So I love it, man. It gets
Now
me all
we
fired
now
up.
we get into the question of nested fictions, right? So if
Yeah.
so Frodo is writing stories inside the Lord of the Rings. What level of reality do those things have? Anyway,
Right.
there's a lot to be said about that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so super awesome. Um, well, dude, this has been huge. The book is Tolkien Dogmatics: Theology through Mythology with the Maker of Middle Earth. Um, there's a lot of good theology that you will learn by reading this book. So I'm really excited about that, and you'll get a ton. Like even just the notes. The notes are huge. Like
Yeah,
if you
don't
read
don't
through the notes,
leave out the footnotes. There's a lot of really good stuff in the footnotes, y'all. End notes, whatever
yeah,
it is.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I have to forgive you that they're endnotes and not
I
footnotes,
didn't.
but
That was not
I
my.
can.
That was not my decision. I think the fact is,
That's
so
awesome.
I'll give a plug for Lexham here. So
Yeah.
Lexham publishes an ebook. They also have it as a Logos Bible software resource, and I think there's just
Hmm.
end notes. I know for me, like when I'm reading digitally, end notes is a lot easier to go through when I'm doing digital resources than having footnotes at the bottom of the page that then
Okay.
have to be navigated. But yes, a lot of good stuff in the footnotes, including a lot of somewhat important stuff that isn't directly related to Tolkien and theology. But yeah, that
Yeah.
one of the reasons I wrote the book is halfway to defend Tolkien from these charges of people that try to say that Tolkien's Christianity is not an important element in his life. Partly so that it can be a sort of one-stop shop for people to do their own further research, because I mean it's pretty exhaustive. Like all of the stuff that
Yeah.
I reference in there, that's it. You can go and you can read it yourself and do your own research from there. Or use it as a classroom text. But part of it is it's a systematic theology, right? It goes through most of the points.
Yeah.
And if this is your avenue into reading a systematic theology for the first time, then that's something that the book can do for you as well.
Yeah. Man, I love that. I love the idea of luring people into philosophy and theology through popular works like this. And I caught that
Yes.
as I'm reading it. I'm like, dude, he's doing it. He's doing what I want to do. That's so good. Yeah. Appreciate that.
Well, cool. Thank you, Parker.
Well, Austin, yeah, sorry, man. I think my internet is being stupid right now, but if people wanted to, so go and grab the book, folks. You can find that. I'll put an affiliate link in the description, or just go to Amazon and find it at Tolkien Dogmatics. If someone wanted to get more of your thoughts, where can they find you at?
So my writings are published in various different venues. I have a book on H.P. Lovecraft and theology, which my chapter in that
Mm.
book that I edited also includes some thoughts on Tolkien. That's available from Lexington Press. Uh, and then I have a few other articles on Tolkien that have appeared in other scholarly journals from Walking Tree Press and other things. I think it's all available on Google Scholar, or at least the citations are. I am not on Twitter yet, but coming back from ETS, everybody's sort of telling me that I kind of need to be on Twitter now. So maybe in the future,
Yeah,
we shall see. But so far, I'm trying to let the work speak for itself at this point.
yeah, that's awesome. I highly recommend it, folks. Go and grab that book. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.